Melodee Buzzard, a 9-year-old girl who mysteriously disappeared in California for over 2 months, has been confirmed deceased in Utah. Her mother, 40-year-old Ashley Buzzard, has been arrested on suspicion of murder. On December 6th, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office received a call from a couple reporting the discovery of a body.
In Lompoc, California, mornings often mean school days. Shoes sit by the door. A backpack rests against the wall. A child might move slowly, still sleepy, still wishing the day could wait. These moments feel safe because they happen again and again. Routines help people feel calm. When something happens every day, adults trust it will happen again tomorrow. A child leaves home. A name is called at school. A seat is filled. Over time, people stop watching closely. They believe the system will notice if something is wrong. But sometimes, what is missing does not make a sound. Before we continue, we want to slow down together. If you're watching right now, take a moment to tell us your name and where you're watching from. You are not alone here. This story matters because people are listening. And if stories like this are important to you, please consider liking this video, sharing it, and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss future updates. Sharing helps these stories reach more people, and that can help protect children. In October 2025, there was a morning when something small did not happen. A child did not arrive where she was expected to be. No footsteps, no backpack moving down the street, no voice answering when a name should have been called. There was no loud moment to mark it, no clear sign, just quiet. Quiet can feel harmless. A child might be sick, plans change, messages get missed. One day can seem unimportant, and when no one feels sure it is their place to speak up, the quiet stays. Days can pass this way. Paperwork waits. Phones stay still. People trust that someone else is paying attention. Life continues around the empty space. Other children laugh. Streets stay busy. The world keeps moving. Far away, there are places where the land is wide and still, where silence feels heavy, where what is missed can stay missed for too long. This story does not begin with fear. It begins with a pause, with something ordinary that quietly broke. It begins with a child who should have been seen. Her name was Melodee Buzzard.
9-year-old Melodee Buzzard's body was found earlier this month, found out of state. Now, this is very shocking and the news that a lot of people have been waiting to hear because it's been several months since she went missing.
And Melodee Buzzard died. Melodee Buzzard was 9 years old, an age where the world still feels open and full of small discoveries. She lived in Lompoc, California, a town where days can feel slow in a comforting way, and where familiar faces often pass each other more than once a day. For Melodee, the world was made up of little things that mattered a lot. She was the kind of child who noticed details, the way sunlight moved across a wall in the afternoon, the sound shoes made on different floors, the feeling of cool air in the morning before the day warmed up. These things stayed with her. They were part of how she understood her place in the world. Melodee had habits that were gentle and ordinary. She liked routines, even small ones, sitting in the same spot, holding things the same way, taking her time when she didn't feel rushed. She wasn't loud by nature, but she wasn't invisible either. She existed in a quiet middle space, where you had to pay attention to truly see her. Like many children her age, Melodee had favorite things that changed often. One week it might be drawing, filling pages with shapes and lines that didn't need to look like anything specific. Another week it might be music, humming softly, sometimes out of tune, but always with feeling. She didn't need to be perfect. She just liked doing things that made time pass gently. She enjoyed comfort, soft fabrics, familiar shows, warm food, the simple safety of knowing what came next. These were not big dreams, but they were real ones. They mattered because they were hers. Melodee also had a thoughtful side. She listened more than she spoke. When adults talked, she paid attention, even if she didn't always understand everything being said. When other children spoke, she watched their faces, learning how people felt, not just what they said out loud. At 9 years old, a child is still learning who they are. Melodee was no different. She was in between stages, no longer a little kid, not yet close to being grown. She was forming opinions, discovering preferences, imagining what she might want to be someday. These ideas were still soft and unfinished, but they existed. She had potential that could not yet be measured. The kind of potential that doesn't show up on paper, the kind that lives in curiosity, kindness, and the ability to grow. Given time, Melodee would have changed in ways no one could fully predict. She would have learned new skills, made new connections, and found new reasons to smile. Children like Melodee often don't demand attention. They don't always ask for help loudly. They assume the world will keep moving around them the way it always has. They trust that adults notice, that systems work, that someone is paying attention. Melodee's life was not defined by one moment. It was made up of many small ones, sitting quietly, watching, waiting, learning. These moments are easy to overlook from the outside, but they are the building blocks of a child's inner world. When we talk about Melodee, it's important to remember that she was more than a name in a report, more than a number, more than a case. She was a child who laughed at things that felt funny to her, a child who got tired, a child who had good days and hard days, just like any other 9-year-old. She belonged in a classroom, in a neighborhood, in a future that had not yet been written. She belonged in a world that made room for her to grow at her own pace. When a child is remembered only for how their story ended, we lose sight of who they truly were. Melodee Buzzard was not defined by silence. She was defined by life, quiet, ordinary, and deeply human. If you're watching this, we invite you to pause for a moment and join the conversation. Share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let us know your name and where you're watching from. Hearing from viewers helps these stories stay visible and reminds us why awareness matters. And if you feel this story is important, consider sharing it with others. Every share helps bring attention to issues that often go unseen.
Development in the case of the missing 9-year-old girl named Melodee, who went missing with her mom during a road trip. Mom returned home without her daughter. Now she's under arrest. And tragically comes news Melodee has been found dead.
She was 9 years old. She was still becoming herself, and she deserved the time and care every child deserves. When a child does not appear where they are expected to be, the response rarely begins with urgency. Most systems are designed to move step by step, guided by rules meant to balance care with caution. In Melodee Buzzard's case, those steps followed a familiar path, one that on its surface appeared reasonable. At first, responsibility rested close to home. Schools track attendance daily, but absences are common and often harmless. Children miss class for illness, family needs, or scheduling changes. A single missed day rarely triggers concern. Even multiple absences can fit within accepted patterns, especially when no immediate danger is reported. The system is built on the idea that families will communicate when something is wrong. As days passed, the expectation remained that the absence would be explained. Each part of the system relied on another to confirm what it could not see directly. Schools waited for confirmation. Local agencies waited for reports.
This shared responsibility was meant to prevent overreaction, to avoid causing alarm where none was needed. When the situation reached a point where formal notice was made, local law enforcement became involved. The Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office took the lead, as it does in cases involving missing children within its jurisdiction.
The circumstances of Melodee Buzzard's murder are heartbreaking.
At this stage, the response followed established procedures. Information was gathered, timelines were reviewed, contacts were made. The goal was to understand what was known and what was not. At the same time, the case did not immediately suggest a broader scope. There was no clear indication that Melodee had traveled far or crossed state lines. Without that information, the case remained primarily local. This approach aligned with standard practice, where resources are focused based on available evidence rather than possibility alone. As time passed and questions remained, additional agencies were brought in to assist. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved to support missing person efforts and help establish a clearer timeline. This transition reflected a growing recognition that the case required more resources and coordination than a single agency could provide on its own. Each step represented a transfer of responsibility, not an abandonment of it. Local authorities continued their work while federal resources added support. This layered approach is designed to increase effectiveness, drawing on different expertise without duplicating effort. Later, when remains were discovered in a rural area of Wayne County, Utah, responsibility expanded again. The Wayne County Sheriff's Office handled the initial discovery and notification, following protocols for cases involving unidentified remains. Once a connection to California was established, communication moved quickly between states. Specialized agencies were included as specific needs arose. The FBI Crime Lab assisted with identification. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives contributed expertise related to evidence analysis. Each involvement followed a clear logic: bring in the agency best suited to address a particular question. From the outside, this sequence can appear fragmented. In reality, it reflects how large systems are designed to function. No single office holds every answer. Responsibility moves along defined channels, guided by jurisdiction, expertise, and available information. At each stage, decisions were made based on what seemed most reasonable at the time. Absences were treated as potentially routine. Local investigation preceded federal involvement. Geographic responsibility shifted when the case crossed state boundaries. These were not unusual choices. They followed policy, precedent, and professional judgment. However, systems that rely on gradual escalation also depend on early signals. When those signals are unclear or delayed, action slows. Responsibility becomes shared, and in being shared can become diffused. Each part waits for confirmation from another, trusting that someone else may already be addressing the concern. The intent behind this structure is stability and fairness. It exists to prevent unnecessary alarm and protect individuals from undue scrutiny. Yet, in cases involving children, time itself becomes a factor. What appears cautious can also become slow. What seems orderly can create gaps. In Melodee Buzzard's case, authority did not fail to respond. It responded as designed. The question that remains is whether the design itself left too much room for waiting. At this point in the story, the system was in motion. Agencies were involved. Procedures were followed. Responsibility had been passed carefully from one set of hands to another, each believing the next step made sense. And still, important time had already passed. If you're watching this, we invite you to pause for a moment and join the conversation. Share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let us know your name and where you're watching from. Hearing from viewers helps these stories stay visible and reminds us why awareness matters. And if you feel this story is important, consider sharing it with others. Every share helps bring attention to issues that often go unseen. The early signs did not arrive all at once. They appeared slowly, spread across days and systems, each one small enough to seem manageable on its own. None of them demanded immediate action. None of them clearly pointed to a serious outcome. Each could be explained, delayed, or set aside. The first sign was absence. School attendance systems are built to handle change. Children miss days for many reasons: illness, family needs, transportation problems, or scheduling misunderstandings are all common. In elementary education especially, absences are frequent and often temporary. A missed day rarely stands out. Even a few missed days can fit within expected patterns. When Melodee Buzzard did not attend school, the absence entered the system as data, a mark on a page, a number in a report. At this stage, the system functioned as intended. There was no immediate indication that the absence was unusual or required escalation. As time passed, the absence continued. Still, this was not automatically alarming. Prolonged absences occur in many families, especially when communication is delayed or inconsistent. Schools are often required to wait for a set number of days before taking further steps. This waiting period exists to allow families time to respond without pressure. The next sign involved communication. Attempts to confirm attendance status rely on contact information. Phone calls may go unanswered. Messages may not be returned immediately. This is not uncommon. Families change numbers. Phones are turned off. Schedules do not always align. A lack of response does not always indicate a problem. It often reflects everyday complications. In Melodee's case, delayed responses did not immediately suggest risk. They fit within a familiar range of administrative challenges. Staff documented efforts and moved forward according to policy. Each step was logged. Each attempt was made in sequence. Another sign was the absence of a clear explanation. When a child misses multiple days, schools typically seek clarification. However, explanations are not always provided quickly. Parents may intend to respond later. Messages may be misunderstood. Documentation may be incomplete. Without confirmation, staff must decide whether to wait or escalate. Both choices carry consequences. Waiting can preserve trust and avoid unnecessary intervention. Escalating too soon can create stress for families and strain limited resources. In this case, waiting aligned with standard practice. The lack of explanation remained a concern, but not an urgent one. The situation remained local. At this point, there was no indication that Melodee had left the area. There were no reports suggesting travel, relocation, or involvement outside the immediate community. Without signs pointing beyond local boundaries, there was no reason to involve outside agencies or broader alerts. Keeping the response contained was consistent with protocol. Another factor was visibility. Melodee was not a child who drew attention through disruption or repeated incidents. She was not frequently involved in disciplinary matters. She did not generate reports that would have created a pattern of concern. In many systems, attention follows disruption. Quiet children are often seen as stable, even when information is missing. This absence of prior concern made the current situation harder to interpret. There was no history suggesting immediate risk. Without context, the missing days remained isolated events rather than part of a larger picture. Time continued to pass. As days turned into weeks, the absence became more noticeable. At this stage, procedures shifted. Reports moved beyond routine attendance tracking. Local authorities were notified. The case entered a different category, one that required review and coordination. Still, even then, each detail appeared explainable. Children sometimes stay with relatives. Families relocate temporarily. Administrative delays can stretch timelines. None of these possibilities were ruled out. Each remained plausible. Another sign was the lack of physical evidence. There were no items found that suggested distress or urgency. No confirmed sightings that raised concern. No reports from neighbors or community members indicating unusual activity. The absence existed largely on paper, not in public view. This limited the ability to assess risk. Without clear indicators, responses relied on procedure rather than instinct. Procedure is designed to be consistent. It treats similar cases similarly, reducing bias and error. In this situation, consistency meant moving forward carefully, step by step. As the case expanded, agencies shared information. Each agency worked within its scope. Data was compared. Timelines were adjusted. The goal was to build clarity from incomplete information. This process takes time, especially when information is limited. Another sign emerged through distance. When remains were later discovered in another state, it became clear that the situation extended beyond the original area. However, before that discovery, there was no clear reason to assume such distance. Long-distance movement is rare in cases involving young children without specific indicators. Assuming it prematurely could have misdirected resources. Each earlier decision was based on likelihood, rather than possibility. Likelihood favored routine explanations. Possibility remained open but undefined. Looking back, the signs form a sequence: absence, delay, limited communication, lack of confirmation, gradual escalation. At no point did a single sign demand immediate action on its own. Each fit within known patterns. Each had precedent. The challenge was accumulation. Systems are often better at responding to single clear signals than to many small ones. When signs are spread across time and responsibility, their combined weight can be hard to measure. One office sees attendance, another handles reports, another reviews timelines. No single point holds the full picture early on. This structure is intentional. It prevents overreaction. It ensures fairness. But it also means that warning signs must align clearly before action accelerates. In Melodee Buzzard's case, alignment came slowly. By the time the signs converged, the situation had already progressed. The early indicators, once viewed together, suggested that something was wrong. But early on, they did not arrive as a unified message. They arrived separately, quietly, and without urgency. None of these signs were ignored. They were processed, logged, reviewed. They moved through systems designed to manage uncertainty. The issue was not absence of action, but the pace at which concern developed. Warning signs are often clear only in hindsight. When viewed forward in time, they appear as ordinary variations. This is what makes early intervention difficult. Decisions must be made without knowing the outcome. In this case, each sign made sense on its own. Together they formed a pattern that became visible only after time had passed. This section of the story is not about fault. It is about structure, about how systems interpret information, about how caution and routine can slow recognition. The warning signs were present. They were subtle. They were explainable. And they were spread across a system that required them to be unmistakable before acting faster. By the time they were unmistakable, the opportunity for early intervention had already narrowed. In systems built to protect children, trust is not evenly distributed. Some voices are treated as reliable by default. Others must work harder to be heard, or are filtered through layers of assumption before they are taken seriously. In Melodee Buzzard's case,
This imbalance did not announce itself openly. It revealed itself through contrast. On one side were the systems and adults considered dependable: attendance records, administrative procedures, established channels of communication. These were given weight because they were familiar and measurable. When they indicated that a situation was still within normal limits, that assessment carried authority. A missing attendance entry on its own was not seen as urgent. Systems are designed to trust that absence will eventually be explained. That trust is built into the structure. It allows schools and agencies to function without constant crisis. In this framework, silence is often interpreted as temporary rather than concerning. On the other side was the child. Melodee did not have a voice within these systems. Her presence was represented only by data points, attendance marks, reports, timelines. When those points went missing, the absence was abstract. It existed as a gap in paperwork, not as a lived reality. The system trusted process over uncertainty. If no clear report suggested danger, the assumption remained that there was none. That assumption did not come from indifference. It came from precedent. Most absences resolve. Most cases do not escalate. Trusting that pattern has worked often enough to become routine. In this context, explanations that maintained stability were accepted more easily than those that disrupted it. A delayed response was easier to trust than an unexplained one. A routine explanation was easier to accept than an unknown possibility. Adults within the system relied on each other. Schools trusted that families would communicate. Agencies trusted that schools would flag concerns. Each part trusted the next to act if action was needed. This mutual trust is meant to create coverage. In practice, it can also create gaps. What was dismissed, or at least deprioritized, was the absence itself as a signal. Not because it was invisible, but because it was familiar. Absence happens often. It rarely leads to serious outcomes. That history shaped interpretation. Melodee's quiet nature added to this imbalance. Children who demand attention through behavior or repeated incidents are more likely to trigger review. Children who blend into routines depend more heavily on systems noticing subtle changes. When those changes are gradual, they can be absorbed without alarm. The system trusted patterns. It trusted that what usually happens would happen again. It trusted that if something was wrong, it would become obvious. What it did not fully trust was uncertainty. Uncertainty requires imagination. It asks decision makers to consider outcomes that are rare and uncomfortable. Systems are not designed to act strongly on low-probability events without clear evidence. Doing so risks overreach, false alarms, and loss of trust with families. So the balance tipped toward caution.
When information was incomplete, the default response was to wait for confirmation rather than assume the worst. This approach is considered responsible. It protects against unnecessary escalation. It preserves resources for cases with clearer indicators. In Melodee's case, this meant that the benefit of the doubt was extended outward, toward explanations that maintained normalcy. The cost of that doubt was borne by the absence itself, which remained unresolved longer than it might have otherwise. There were moments when concern could have grown faster. Each time, the decision leaned toward restraint, not because concern was absent, but because it did not outweigh the trust placed in established explanations. This dual perspective was not explicit. No one formally decided to trust adults over a child. The imbalance existed quietly, embedded in how systems assign credibility. Adults have voices. They can explain delays. They can provide reasons. Children rely on representation. When that representation is incomplete, their perspective is limited. As agencies became involved, This pattern continued. Information shared between offices focused on what was known. What was unknown remained secondary. The case moved forward, but within boundaries shaped by trust in process. Even when additional agencies joined, the framework remained the same. Each new participant relied on the groundwork laid before. Assumptions traveled along with files. Early interpretations influenced later ones. This is not unique to this case. It is a structural feature of complex systems. Early framing matters. Once a situation is categorized as routine, shifting that category requires strong evidence. For Melodee, strong evidence arrived slowly. The imbalance did not come from malice or neglect. It came from efficiency. Systems must prioritize. They must decide where to focus attention. Those decisions are guided by probability, not possibility. But children exist in possibility. Their vulnerability does not always align with statistical expectation. Their risk does not always announce itself clearly. When systems rely too heavily on what usually happens, they can miss what is actually happening. In this case, trust flowed toward stability, toward explanations that fit existing patterns, toward processes that assumed resolution. Dismissal was not overt, but implicit. The absence did not outweigh the comfort of normal assumptions. Only later, when the full scope became clear, did the imbalance become visible. In hindsight, it is easier to see how much weight was placed on trust and how little on doubt. At the time, the choices felt measured. They felt reasonable. They felt aligned with professional standards. This section of the story does not assign blame. It shows contrast between who is heard and who is represented, between what is trusted and what is set aside, between systems designed for efficiency and the needs of a single child. Melodee Buzzard existed at the quiet center of this imbalance. She did not generate noise. She did not disrupt systems. She relied on them to notice when something changed. The dual perspective is this: the system trusted itself to work as designed, and the child depended on that trust to be enough.
Ashley was on a road trip with her 9-year-old daughter. Surveillance footage captured them both wearing wigs at a local car rental company. In the next 3 days, this rental car will pass through Nebraska, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and Kansas. During this period, Ashley deliberately covered up her whereabouts and changed her license plate. Investigators confirmed that Ashley was seen driving the same car back to her residence on October 10th.
The timeline begins in October 2025. At that point, Melodee Buzzard was 9 years old and living in Lompoc, California. Her absence had already been noted, documented, and reviewed. By the time a formal missing person report was filed, several days had passed since she was last confirmed to be where she was expected to be. The case entered an active phase, marked by the transition from administrative concern to investigative action. In the days immediately following the report, local authorities focused on establishing a clear baseline. Investigators worked to determine when Melodee had last been seen, who had last had confirmed contact with her, and what information could be verified through records and statements. This period involved reviewing attendance data, timelines, and known locations. Each detail was placed in order, creating the first structured outline of events. By late October, search and inquiry efforts expanded. Information was shared internally and across agencies as part of standard missing child procedures. At this stage, the case remained centered in California. There was no confirmed evidence suggesting movement outside the area. Investigators proceeded based on what could be confirmed, rather than what was possible. As November began, the absence extended beyond what could be explained by routine delays. The timeline grew longer, and the case required broader coordination. Federal resources were brought in to assist with analysis and missing person efforts. This marked a shift from local containment to multi-agency involvement, reflecting the length of time that had passed without resolution. Throughout November, investigators worked to refine the timeline. Leads were assessed and reassessed. Records were reviewed for consistency. Each update adjusted the working understanding of the sequence, narrowing some possibilities while leaving others open. The process was methodical, focused on accuracy rather than speed. In early December 2025, a separate development occurred hundreds of miles away. In a rural area of Wayne County, Utah, remains were discovered. At the time of discovery, there was no immediate identification. The location was remote, and the discovery followed standard procedures for cases involving unidentified individuals. Local authorities secured the area and initiated notification protocols. The next phase unfolded over days rather than hours. Information from the Utah discovery was compared against missing person cases from other states. This comparison process relies on shared databases, physical descriptors, and available records. During this period, no assumptions were made publicly. Identification required confirmation. The remains were sent for forensic examination. Specialists worked to establish identity through scientific means rather than circumstantial connection. This step was necessary to ensure accuracy. It also required time. Later in December, forensic analysis confirmed that the remains were those of Melodee Buzzard. This confirmation marked a definitive point in the timeline. What had been a missing person case became a death investigation. Jurisdictional responsibilities adjusted accordingly. California authorities were notified, and coordination between states intensified. Following identification, additional investigative steps were taken to align timelines. Agencies worked backward from the point of discovery, comparing travel possibilities, timeframes, and known data. This process was focused on sequence, when movement may have occurred, how distance factored in, and where gaps remained. By the end of December, the known sequence included 3 key phases: Melodee's disappearance in October, the extended period of uncertainty through November, and the discovery and identification in December. Each phase carried its own set of questions, but together they formed a clearer structure. In early 2026, investigative efforts continued. Evidence analysis expanded. Specialized agencies contributed expertise relevant to specific findings. This phase was about confirmation rather than discovery, verifying what could be established with certainty and distinguishing it from what could not. Throughout this process, public communication remained measured. Authorities released information carefully, aligned with confirmed facts. The focus stayed on accuracy and procedural integrity rather than speculation. The event, when viewed through time markers, is not a single moment. It is a sequence stretched across weeks. October marked the beginning of absence. November marked prolonged uncertainty. December marked confirmation and closure of the search phase. Each step followed the last, shaped by available information at that time. The timeline matters because it shows progression. It shows how the case moved from routine concern to active investigation, and finally to forensic confirmation. It also shows where time accumulated, not suddenly but gradually. By the time the event reached its final definition, the sequence was complete. The absence had been explained not by return but by discovery. This section ends where certainty begins. The next part of the story examines what the evidence revealed, and how fact replaced uncertainty. If you're watching this, we invite you to pause for a moment and join the conversation. Share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let us know your name and where you're watching from. Hearing from viewers helps these stories stay visible and reminds us why awareness matters. And if you feel this story is important, consider sharing it with others. Every share helps bring attention to issues that often go unseen. Once identification was confirmed, the focus of the case shifted from locating a missing child to establishing what could be known with certainty. This phase relied less on assumption and more on verification. The work moved into laboratories, evidence rooms, and structured review, where conclusions are built slowly and tested repeatedly. The first point of confirmation came through forensic identification. Specialists at the FBI crime lab conducted DNA analysis to establish identity. This process compared biological material recovered in Utah with existing records. The result provided a definitive match. At that moment, uncertainty about identity ended. The case now had a fixed reference point. With identification established, timelines were revisited. Investigators compared known dates from California with the location of the remains in Wayne County, Utah. Distance, travel time, and possible routes were evaluated. Early explanations that assumed Melodee had remained local no longer aligned with the evidence. those assumptions collapsed under geographic fact. Jurisdictional coordination intensified. The Wayne County Sheriff's Office documented the discovery site and handled initial evidence control following procedures for cases involving minors and cross-state investigation. Once identity was confirmed, information moved quickly back to California. The Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office remained the lead investigative agency. Their role expanded from missing person coordination to full investigative review. This included re-interviewing witnesses, reassessing timelines, and examining prior assumptions in light of new facts. One of the central forensic tasks was sequencing. Investigators worked backward from the discovery site, mapping potential movement across state lines. This process relies on exclusion as much as inclusion. Routes that were implausible were eliminated. Timeframes that did not align with verified data were set aside. As forensic work progressed, expert input increased. Analysts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation assisted with timeline reconstruction and data comparison. Their role was not to speculate, but to narrow uncertainty through cross-referencing records, communications, and verified points of contact. Another critical component involved evidence analysis beyond identification. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives contributed specialized expertise related to ballistic evidence. Their findings addressed specific questions raised during the investigation. These findings were technical and precise, designed to answer whether physical evidence aligned with known records. As evidence accumulated, earlier contradictions began to resolve. Initial gaps in explanation, where Melodee had been, how she might have traveled, and when movement occurred, were no longer equally plausible. Some theories could not withstand forensic scrutiny. Others remained possible but narrowed. This is how investigative truth forms, not as a single revelation, but as a process of collapse. Each verified fact reduces the space available for uncertainty. Explanations that once seemed reasonable lose coherence when confronted with measured data. Legal standards require this kind of convergence. Conclusions must rest on evidence that can be documented, reviewed, and defended. In this phase, investigators focused on what could be established beyond doubt, separating confirmed findings from unanswered questions. One of the most significant shifts involved timing. Forensic analysis indicated that the sequence of events did not align with assumptions of short-term absence or delayed reporting alone. The duration between disappearance and discovery mattered. It reframed earlier decisions and timelines, showing where assumptions had filled gaps later occupied by evidence. Records from multiple agencies were synchronized. Attendance logs, communication attempts, investigative notes, and forensic results were compared side by side. Inconsistencies were flagged. When discrepancies appeared, priority was given to verifiable data over recollection or inference. Legal review followed a similar pattern. Investigators examined whether procedures had been followed, whether jurisdictional handoffs complied with policy, and whether information flow met required standards. This review was not about assigning blame at this stage, but about understanding process. As contradictions collapsed, a clearer narrative emerged. Not a complete one. Some questions remained, but one grounded in confirmed facts rather than assumption. The case no longer depended on what might have happened, but on what evidence could support. This clarity also changed public understanding. Statements and updates became more precise. Language shifted from possibility to confirmation. The focus narrowed to findings that could be supported in court if necessary. Importantly, this phase highlighted the difference between early uncertainty and later certainty. Early in the case, lack of information created space for multiple explanations. Later, forensic truth constrained those explanations sharply. What remained was not speculation, but record. The legal truth of the case rests on this foundation. It is built from documentation, expert analysis, and interagency verification. It does not rely on intuition or narrative convenience. It stands because each component supports the next. In Melodee Buzzard's case, forensic work did not add drama. It removed it. It replaced questions with answers, and narrowed the field of possibility until only supported conclusions remained. This process does not bring resolution in an emotional sense. It brings accuracy. It defines what can be said with confidence, and what must remain unknown.
By early 2026, the investigative picture was no longer fragmented. The contradictions that once allowed delay had fallen away. What remained was a factual record, structured, verified, and binding. The forensic and legal truth does not speak loudly, it speaks precisely. And once established, it cannot be ignored. When cases like this are examined closely, the focus often turns inward, toward individual decisions or moments of hesitation. But the larger question is structural. What allowed the situation to continue without interruption? What conditions made delay possible? And how could the outcome have been altered by earlier coordinated action? In Melodee Buzzard's case, prevention does not point to a single misstep. It points to a system that required too many confirmations before it allowed itself to act. The first layer of failure involved visibility. Attendance systems are designed to record absence, not to interpret it. A child who is not present becomes a data entry, not an alert. This works when absences are short and communication is consistent. It fails when absence becomes prolonged without explanation. The system recorded what happened, but it did not elevate concern quickly enough. This was not due to neglect by any one individual. It was the result of thresholds. Policies often require a certain number of days before escalation. Those thresholds are meant to prevent unnecessary intervention. In this case, they created delay. Prevention would have required lower thresholds for concern when communication was incomplete. Another layer involved fragmentation. Responsibility for child welfare is divided across institutions, schools, local agencies, social services, and law enforcement. Each has a defined role. None has complete oversight at the earliest stage. Information moves between them only when specific criteria are met. This structure assumes that risk becomes visible through accumulation. It assumes that warning signs will align clearly enough to trigger action. In Melodee's case, the signs were distributed. No single office saw enough on its own to justify immediate escalation. Prevention would have required a mechanism for shared visibility earlier in the process. Communication protocols also played a role. Systems rely on families to respond, explain, and confirm. When that communication does not occur, the response is often to wait rather than escalate. This preserves trust, but it also assumes that silence is temporary. A more preventive approach would treat prolonged silence as a signal in itself, not proof of harm but proof of uncertainty. Uncertainty involving a child should shorten timelines, not extend them. Geographic assumptions further limited early action. Because there was no immediate indication of long-distance movement, the response remained local. This is standard practice. Resources are allocated based on likelihood. However, children do not operate according to probability models. Prevention would require earlier consideration of less likely scenarios, even when evidence is limited. Another systemic issue was prioritization. Agencies handle multiple cases simultaneously. Attention is directed toward situations with visible urgency. Quiet cases, especially those without public indicators, move more slowly. This is not a moral failure. It is an operational one. Preventive systems account for this by creating automatic escalation points that do not depend on perceived urgency. In this case, escalation depended on judgment rather than automation. Judgment varied across roles, creating inconsistency. Oversight mechanisms also matter. Reviews of prolonged absences often occur after thresholds are crossed, not during their accumulation. By the time formal review happens, time has already passed. Prevention would require interim checks, moments where cases are reassessed even if criteria are not fully met. Importantly, this is not about hindsight perfection. It is about recognizing that systems are designed around averages. Most children who miss school return. Most communication gaps resolve. Most cases do not end tragically. But systems built for averages fail those who fall outside them. Preventing outcomes like this requires designing for exception, not just norm. Early intervention does not mean immediate accusation or forceful response. It can mean welfare checks, cross-agency consultation, temporary monitoring. These steps do not assign blame. They buy time. Time is the variable that matters most. In Melodee Buzzard's case, time passed in small increments. Each delay felt reasonable. Each extension seemed justified. Together they formed a gap wide enough for prevention to slip through. Responsibility then does not rest with one person or one office. It rests with how systems distribute responsibility so thinly that no one holds it fully at the earliest stage. The failure was not a lack of care. It was a lack of integration. Prevention would have required earlier coordination between school attendance tracking and child welfare protocols. It would have required policies that treat unexplained absence differently from explained absence. It would have required tools that elevate uncertainty involving children more quickly. It also would have required cultural change. A shift from assuming resolution to actively confirming safety. From waiting for evidence of harm to acting on evidence of absence. This case highlights how easily a child can become administratively invisible. Present in records but absent in response. Known but not seen. Systemic failure is rarely dramatic. It is quiet. It happens through routine adherence rather than obvious mistakes. That is why it repeats. If this story leads to prevention, it will not be through outrage alone. It will be through redesign. Through policies that shorten timelines. Through systems that share concern earlier. Through an understanding that silence when it involves a child deserves attention. Melodee Buzzard did not need extraordinary intervention. She needed timely recognition. The lesson is not that systems should abandon caution. It is that caution must include the cost of waiting. Prevention lives in that balance. At the end of every investigation, after reports are closed and timelines finalized, one truth remains unchanged. A child lived here. Melodee Buzzard was 9 years old. Before systems, before procedures, before records and reviews, she was a child moving through ordinary days. She had a place in the world that belonged only to her, a height she stood at, a voice that sounded like hers, thoughts that had not yet been fully spoken. When a story becomes defined by process, it is easy to forget that it began with a person. This section returns to that beginning. Melodee's life cannot be measured by how it ended. It should be remembered for what it was before anything went wrong. A childhood still forming, a future still open, time that should have been filled with growth, learning and safety. A memorial is not only about grief, it is about recognition. It is about saying that this life mattered enough to be seen clearly, not reduced to a sequence of events. Melodee mattered not because of what happened to her, but because she existed. Remembering her means holding on to that truth. It also means acknowledging what her story asks of the rest of us. Not emotionally, but practically. Awareness begins with noticing absence. Not just recording it, but questioning it. Asking why. Asking sooner. Understanding that when a child is not where they are expected to be, time matters even when explanations seem likely. Prevention does not require fear. It requires attention. This story shows how easily a child can disappear into routine, how silence can be mistaken for normal delay, how responsibility can be shared so widely that urgency fades. These are not rare conditions. They exist everywhere systems exist. Awareness means recognizing that children rely on adults and institutions to notice what they cannot articulate themselves. They depend on thresholds being low, not high, on questions being asked early, not late. Prevention lives in small decisions. A follow-up made sooner. A check-in that feels unnecessary but happens anyway. A system that treats uncertainty involving a child as a reason to act, not to wait. Melodee Buzzard should have grown older. She should have changed, learned and found new parts of herself. That future cannot be restored. But meaning can still be drawn from what was lost. Memorializing her is not about assigning guilt. It is about honoring her by making absence harder to overlook for the next child. By making systems more responsive. By making attention more intentional. Every child deserves to be counted not just on paper, but in practice. Seen not only when they arrive, but noticed when they do not. If this story stays with you, let it sharpen awareness rather than fade into memory. Let it encourage questions where silence exists. Let it support changes that shorten response times and widen responsibility. Melodee Buzzard was here. She should not be remembered only as a case, but as a child whose life calls for better protection. That is how remembrance becomes prevention.